Did you end up liking Thomas Mann?
Oh, I did. I mean, it wasn't even a question that there was no possibility of disliking him. I mean that possibility just wasn't even open. In other words, I was attempting to inhabit him, and therefore, if he did something I disapproved of, my job was to suppress myself. I mean, I had no role in like or dislike in that. My job was to make him and keep trying to see as much as I could of the world from his point of view.
You do that very well. But you also say that his tone is ponderous, ceremonious, civilized, and that he wears masks to disguise his base sexual desires.
Yes, but this was something that he himself, I mean, he knew he had a ponderous style. So there were moments when he sought to break that, especially when he was breaking with Hitler. I mean, when he was actually, going to write a letter saying that he deplored what the Nazis were doing, he realized that he had better not decide to do it in his ironic, ponderous way, that he'd better make himself clear for once. In other words, he had that in common with Henry James, that there was an elaborate style, and it was considered to be old-fashioned and ponderous. And of course, there was, at the base of him, and of everything he did in public and everything he did in private, this idea that his desires would remain secret and they would not give him away, but then every so often he would break that. I mean, in other words, it isn't as though he held to that all his life. He wrote Death in Venice,
yeah.
He wrote Death in Venice, but he also wrote the ending of Buddenbrooks, in which the young Hanno has a boy coming to him. There's a homoerotic element in The Magic Mountain, as there is in Dr. Faustus. So he was hiding in plain sight, which is a very strange idea. But even in Germany to this day, there are German critics who think that I queered him as though the diaries don't exist or the books don't exist.
Right.
In other words, he did it in plain sight so well with his beautiful suits and his ponderous tone and his 6 children that everyone believed him, and people believe him up to this day.
I used to date Tony Halbert, who wrote one of the first biographies of Mann, and he told me that Mann in California would go to the beach and look for hours at the boys.
Tony Halbert's book is probably the breakthrough book. There isn't anything like it in any other language either. That's somebody who really looked at eros and really looked at the amount of time man spent thinking about sex. And how this came out was in his gaze, in the quality of his gaze. And so at a reading with 400 Germans listening to every word, the lecture would last for 2 hours. And with questions and signings afterwards, his diary afterwards would always be 3rd row. I caught his eye. For 1 second, our eyes locked. And the same thing in Santa Monica. He would often be with his wife. I mean, he didn't drive the car down to the beach. She did. And they would walk along, both of them, and they would stop. And he would do his gazing, and she would do whatever she did.
Do you think she understood or accepted?
We have to remember just how bohemian those Prinzheims were when she met him when she married him in around 1905. Her grandmother was the most famous feminist in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And so, homosexuality was nothing to them.
To them, no.
I mean, the big surprise was when the anti-Semitism took, because they had no idea that was going on. They were assimilated Jews. They were tremendously rich themselves from old coal money, share money. The father was a professor of mathematics. The twin brother, who was gay also, was a student of Mahler's as a conductor.
Yeah.
And so they gave great parties. The father had a mistress.
And you'll say they had 700 people to dinner.
Yeah, they did anything like that. And of course, there was nothing dull about them. So the arrival of this fellow from Lübeck, who had written this great book, I remember asking Nadine Gordimer, when she married one of the Kasserers, who were the famous German intellectual family that come down to South Africa. And she was from a small town, and she was this little Jewish girl from a small town. Like, what did it mean? How did they treat her? She said, "Oh, you don't understand," she said. "You see, I'd written a novel, and for them that was everything."
That was enough.
And so too, when man arrived down, when they saw him, it wasn't that he was provincial, or it wasn't that he'd no money. He was the author of Buddenbrooks.
Yeah.
That would have mattered more to them than respectability or heterosexuality or all those other things. So she had that wasn't an issue.
The only woman that Genet was ever in love with was called Lily Pringsheim.
Ah.
And she was from the Czech Republic. and he had a passionate correspondence with her. Anyway, you know, like with this book and the Henry James book, it's as though you, well, especially this one, you feel obliged to write about everything from birth to death, and to, or at least childhood to death, and to talk about all the major works, all the major moves to different places, and other people like Banville in his Mrs. Osmond. Well, that's of course about a character, not a person, a character in the book. But I wrote a book called Hotel to Dream, in which there's a character, Stephen Crane, and I just took an episode in his life that was hearsay that nobody really knew, and that became the central part of my book. But you're very straightforward. But why don't, I guess everyone will ask you the question, why don't you write a biography?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. The first one is I set out initially to write a novel about Thomas Mann writing Dr. Faustus in California in about 1947-48, with Adorno coming to the house every day, with Mann trying to get to grips with 12 tones, with the 12-tone system, with Schoenberg living close by, with Alma Mahler over there, and the war over and the beginning of the Cold War. And that was the book.
Yeah.
The problem is that you had to go back to explain how he met Katia, how she came to marry him, what is homosexuality, how it emerged. And if you want to do all this as flashback, you've got to remember you've got other things coming. How badly he behaved in 1914 in the First World War.
Yes.
How his marriage happened, how those 6 children, came in. So you realize the amount of flashback I'm going to have to do, concentrating on merely 3 years, maybe in the 40s, is so enormous that I'm going to miss something I really need, which is the shock value that in July 1940 no one knew what was coming in August. That before Hitler really took power, no one, I say Thomas Mann certainly didn't know it was going to happen. So the number of things that were unexpected, I began to feel the reader needed to experience these in real time, so the reader didn't know they were coming either, almost.
Yeah.
And then the reason not to write a biography is really simple, that I have no interest whatsoever in knowledge. And that my interest was in creating the illusion, an illusion for the reader, that you are in the room.
But it's interesting that you chose such a brainy character.
Yes, but in my version of him, he's not exactly that brainy.
No.
In other words, he never went to university. His reading is just haphazard. Sometimes Katia said something that was a key for me for so much, that don't ever ask him anything, because he never knows anything more than what's in the book or the article or the lecture. And a lot of us have lived like that,
yes,
where you're on the hoof constantly,
and
people think you know deeply on this subject. No, I just wrote a piece. Read my piece, because honestly,
that's all I know.
You know much more, and it's a constant problem for anyone who's skating in that sort of way.
And also, if you do write, like I wrote a biography of Jean Genet, and then people think that that's all you're interested in, the rest of your life they ask you questions about it.
Yes. So the idea here is that he isn't exactly brainy, but the whole business of the inheritance is brainy. In other words, if you're a German writer born in 1875 as he was, then you have a big burden on you, which is the burden of philosophy, of poetry, and of music.
Yes.
So the big question was music more than the others, because I felt I could write about it more freely. And I didn't go near philosophy because he didn't either much. He knew bits and pieces of Schopenhauer and stuff, but the music was something I could work with. But also I was skating. I was working, and
you write about music the way Proust does. You talk about the moods and what you feel, but it's not what a composer would write. But I like that.
You can't really in a novel be technical, can you? With
No.
music, you can't say F sharp slowly descended into whatever.
When people, I read lots of books about music. I'm writing something about Beethoven right now, but it always puts me to sleep. Amazingly, he gets from D sharp major to D minor.
Yeah, and the glissando wasn't ordinary, you know. And, but I have him listening to Opus 132, Beethoven, and
Yeah.
his mind wanders all the time, and then he tries to look again. And of course, he's fascinated, as anyone ever is, by a string
the
quartet,
musician.
by
Yeah.
their suits, how they're bearing, and
And I love that where you said that maybe two of the musicians were American and had this kind of rangy movement, but by the time they were really into the music, they looked like Hungarians.
yeah, that's really a code word for Jewish.
Uh-huh.
You know, in other words, that he was seeing something that that he knew had disappeared now from the streets of Munich, from all those streets that he knew, which was sons of Jewish families going for their music practice. I mean, it's a cliche.
Yeah.
So I didn't put in Jewish, I put in Hungarian, but I think the reader knows what I mean.
If you were writing about a Frenchman, you'd say cosmopolitan.
Yes.
That means Jewish.
Yes.
When you say that he would, if he would write for an hour and a half, he could lie down for 10 minutes. Do you do that?
It's more chocolate, it's more checking emails, it's more, yeah, but I do nap. And his 4 hours every morning was such a ritual for him that he could really do quite a lot. You know, if you go into an office for 4 hours every morning and work, you can produce a lot. You can produce Joseph and his brothers in no time.
What's interesting about Mann, in your version of Mann, is that there really is a boy in Venice. There really is cholera. That he really does stay on the Lido. That there really is Mahler or some other composer. And, I mean, like, in other words, you substantiate the fiction.
Yeah, I do have a source sometimes, a really good one, which is that Katia, his wife, wrote her memoirs. And that's in her memoir.
Oh,
that
yeah.
Tommy and myself went to Venice, stayed in the hotel. They were with Heinrich. And Mahler just died as they arrived. And Tommy could not stop looking at this boy on the beach. Now, she says he didn't follow him in the streets. And she says a lovely thing, that he didn't do. but all the rest happened. And not only that, but biographers have been able to find the boy.
Oh, yes, I know about that.
No, I don't mean the actor. I mean the actual
there was
fellow.
a book about the actual boy
Yeah.
who became this fat businessman.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
actor who died.
The actor who died. There's also there are marvelous interviews with the waiter, who he met when he was 75 and fell in love with in Switzerland. The Bavarian waiter, the fleshy Bavarian waiter.
Oh, yeah.
He remembered him well and remembered him very fondly. And Thomas Mann, but I mean, he said in his diaries, "I would exchange world fame," which is what he had, for time with this man. He was 75. So you just think, if he could write that in his diaries, and if he could make sure those diaries were kept and published after his death, which was his wish, I think that meant something. I would exchange world fame.
Well, we understand that, don't we?
Yeah, but I mean, Yeats has it, but oh, that I were young again,
Yeah.
and she were in my arms.
You've written about James and about Mann, and there are two kinds of closetedness. How would you contrast them, their strategies for...
You see, James, by about 1895, in other words, in his 50s, found a few people that he could work with, as it were.
Mm.
In other words, if you just go through who he's seeing, you realize that there's a small world now, and sometimes closeted, sometimes not, of bachelors, certainly, who are seeing him and who know about him. The wider world doesn't. He gives no interviews, and he generally doesn't appear in public. But he has this little world, and he has a number of young boyfriends, and it's unclear whether they're having sex or not, but they're certainly going around like a couple. Lady Gregory's nephew, Jocelyn, who seems a very jolly, sort of thoughtless fellow. James loved him and wrote to him and went to Edinburgh with him, and so it is as though he begins to find...
What's that one who came toward him with his arms open and James said, I can't.
Oh, you see, young men would come down from London to Rye, and they would go back to London and do imitations of the master. And that's how the word master got going, like, oh, I was down with the master. Like, oh, what happened? Well, he said, and one of them was brave enough to say to him, well, why don't we just go to bed together? Because you go back to London and tell everybody. And James just said, I can't, which I take to mean, I won't.
Oh.
In other words, he just, by that time,
He's gotten used
really,
to Chastity.
yes, and so, you know, it's very hard to judge with James because there is something underneath, which is as soon as he arrived in Rye, which is 1897, he found a 14-year-old guy who was a featherweight boxer and who was called Burgess Noakes. And Burgess is the person who wakes him each morning, puts him to, you know, sees his bed at night, like looks after his bedroom all the time. Burgess never married, and at the end of in the First World War, when Henry James was dying, the Prime Minister agreed that Burgess could come back from the trenches and be with Mr. James when he was dying. And there's a wonderful interview with Burgess done in 1956 for radio. He said, "Mr. Guy James," and he was a marvellous man. And he's got a wonderful sort of rural English accent. And there's a wonderful letter James wrote to him when he was going to France. James was going to the trenches, he was going to the war, he was going to mustard gas. And James wrote him a letter about, you know, do not judge the French at the beginning too harshly, but do spend time with them. You get to know them better and appreciate the country more. What universe was James living in?
Yeah.
But he, you know, he had that relationship all day, every day with this kid who seemed to be a very good-humoured fellow, and they seemed to get on very well together. I'm not suggesting they had sex or anything, maybe, but they, you know, he wasn't as lonely as he suggests. But man, of course, was locked domestically in always with, like Katia was always there. He went for a walk with her every day.
Mm-hmm.
It was very hard to escape for man, but man did escape more into fiction. In other words, Death in Venice is unmistakable.
Yeah.
James did not write anything as open as that.
No.
But I mean, I think the big,
except the pupil.
yes, but the book is about somebody else. And the book
Yeah.
could be about Singer Sargent's childhood
Yeah.
as much as his own.
Yeah.
But the big difference is war. That James more or less lived in a time of peace. He came into his own as a writer at the end of the American Civil War, and he was dying by the time the First World War broke out.
Mm-hmm.
So he has a full life, more or
Of
less,
peace.
in peace. And his characters also do. Man, you can just imagine. Like 1914 begins, and it's going to begin as a sort of beginning of a nightmare. And so his life was deeply affected, obviously, by the two wars and by the Cold War.
In this book, you have so many characters who play off of each other, like Heinrich and Thomas. How would you contrast them?
Oh, I mean, that's really what James and man have in common, and what I suppose I have as well. In the way the second son in a family of five, I am, and they are. And the older boy is more athletic, and is the sort of boy who likes being outdoors. And Heinrich Mann, William James, that's, you know, so they lived, both of them, Henry James and Thomas, in the shadow
Mm-hmm.
of this boy
William
that they
James.
couldn't really ever compete with. But they competed with their brother in all their lives in various ways.
Yes.
And so that's a story that never, in the same way as wanting his father's approval, even though his father is dead, you know, wanting Lübeck to like him, wanting Heinrich to see what a great man he was. He ended up, of course, paying for Heinrich. So he really did win that particular battle.
Do you think he's generous to Heinrich? I thought he was a little sketchy, but
Well, I love the moment where Heinrich finds himself in an apartment, and this did happen somewhere in LA, I think Santa Monica, where the kitchen and the dining room was the same room.
Raymond.
Heinrich had never come across such a thing, and he thought it was the lowest you could go. But that was, I mean, they were paying his rent.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think they shared their income with him. I think they gave him a stipend.
That's all.
And I think Katia would have overseen this very, very, very carefully. But I mean, what would you do if you had an older brother, you know, and you had all this wonderful establishment? Yeah, he gave him enough to live on, but they didn't. He didn't live in any splendor.
I support my sister, but badly.
Yeah, I think it's a common thing about support. It's never enough.
Never enough.
Yeah.
Tell me, do you have a real life model for your major characters? Not the Mon himself, but somebody you know who reminds you of Mon? Or do you write out of a part of yourself?
I suppose I write out of a part of myself, out of what most preoccupies me. In other words, that idea of a family, that idea of coming from. I mean, when he went out the door in Lübeck, he was instantly known on the street by everybody. When
Yeah.
he went to Munich, this wasn't true. So I mean, obviously, I've lived through that. I know what that's like
Mhm.
to come from a small town where everyone knows you,
Yes.
and then be in Dublin, say. And so,
Seamus Haney said to me, I asked him once, I said, what's it like to be so famous? And he said, in Ireland, everybody's famous.
yes, in Ireland, being a member of a family is a sort of fame. You say, oh, that's the third brother. Oh, is that the third brother? You know, everyone would be
right.
interested in that. But I suppose that there are moments when you do have to. You see, what I tried to do was imagine him as a ghost, that he's not present in the novel, that everyone else is fully present. You know, when his daughter Erica comes into the room, she immediately speaks.
Mm-hmm.
And she's got a big argument to make with someone over something. So too with Golo, so too with Klaus, so too with Heinrich, so too with Katja.
Mm-hmm.
That man, when he comes out of his study, almost doesn't speak. So there's a moment where there's a big dinner, and all of them are there, all of them from the novel. And he realizes that if he stood up and went away, none of them would notice. They were also involved. Yes.
I often feel that.
And also that he had imagined each of them. You know, he'd written so-and-so for Death in Venice, so-and-so for Buddenbrook, so-and-so for Royal Highness, that he put each of them in the books. That he had made them. And there was nothing to be done. But it isn't as though he's ever fully there. It is a sense that, and I'm not just saying his real life was in his study, that would be a stupid thing to say, but I'm saying that there was no real life. that in other words, he was hardly there at all. And that means ideologically, he could waver, he could go any way. Sexually, he could mask himself totally and then fill himself with desire in his diaries. He could sway in any direction, that he could be fully loyal to Katja in one way, you know, by staying domestically with her. But it meant that the whole question of love really matters here. Because Adrian Leverkusen, anyone he loves, as in the Faust myth, anyone he loves has to be destroyed. And it's a breathtaking idea.
Well, it doesn't Katja get mad at him because he writes about the death of his grandson?
Yeah, it's a problem every novelist has. I think he brought it to an extreme, that he had a grandson called Frido, and everyone loved, Frido's still alive, and everyone loved Frido. And he was also he spoke the German that his parents had taught him. He was precocious, and Thomas Mann just loved him, just loved his company. And so much so that he needed something for Adrian Leverkusen to love. And he gave him a beautiful nephew called Echo, precocious, and you know, everyone adored this kid who was sent to live with his uncle. And the boy dies over pages of slow meningitis. And it is really grotesque and really sad, and done with extraordinary realism. For example, as he's suffering this extraordinary pain, the kid in the novel says, "Echo will be good, Echo be good," meaning, you know, he thought he was being punished in some way. And it's really well done. It's really well dramatized, but it is, for all of the family, they realize he has taken the thing he loved most, which is Frido, put him into a novel and killed him. Which he did to himself, of course, in Buddenbrooks.
Yeah.
He describes his own death as though he had died as a 12-year-old. The child Hanno, who's clearly based on him,
Yeah.
just dies slowly of some sort of typhoid.
Yeah. This is sort of technical, but I mean, I don't know if our viewers will be interested in this, but do you have a method for deciding when you write dialogue and when you summarize the scene?
I mean, the big technical problem with this novel, The Magician, is when to summarize and when to just go blasting on the dialogue. And I realized that the less I summarized, the happier I would be when I read it again. And sometimes, having summarized, I had to cut the summary because it was just too boring. It was written in the language of information, you know, to tell you, and that summer they went, you know, and just go, that's the deadest paragraph you've ever written. And the thing to do with it is, don't rewrite it, cut it, and then see where you are. And also, as soon as Erica comes into the room, she must say something interesting. But more than anything, Katja must be allowed all the time, dominate the thing by saying the most interesting thing all the time. And the dialogue, how do you write dialogue from 100 years ago in a foreign language? Like, do you make it Germanic? In which case you just lose everybody.
Yeah.
So what I thought of doing was to write dialogue straight from Hemingway sometimes, to get as close to that sort of 20s sound, which is clipped, quick, with a lot of interruption, with a lot of half-said things, and going right down the page with it like that. I thought the more I do that, the less likely I am to lose the reader. Because the worry all the time was, using this form, which is the chronological form a biographer uses, you're going to lose the reader and they were going to be interested in one thing more than another, and you're going to say, you're not seriously going to now take us into the First World War, the Second World War. Yes, I am. But in order to do it, I have to liven the thing up radically. And the way that was done was using the dialogue.
From the point of view of Mann, looking at what does it mean to me?
Yes, in other words, he had to. It's always from his point of view. So he has to be in the room, but he's not the best. He doesn't make the best arguments, whereas there are moments where Erica goes very, very close to being abusive to her mother, and I thought that'd be real fun just to get the two of them out there with Thomas listening, absolutely beguiled by the two of them in how much they were ready to insult each other.
I think Alma, of course, is a wonderful character too, because she is so outspoken, and she says, "Well, here I am marrying all these Jews."
Yeah,
and
you see, they loved her, Thomas, despite everything she did and said, and her anti-Semitism, her outspokenness, and her general idiocy. They loved her because she reminded them of great times in the old days when women like her could thrive in Munich and in Vienna. That was the world they'd lost. Was her. And of course they adored Mahler. You see, Mahler for them was you see, Mann's taste in music didn't really go beyond Mahler. I mean, he was writing about Adrian Leverkusen and interested in Schoenberg, but he wasn't putting Schoenberg on in the evening to listen to.
No one is.
But he was putting Mahler on. No, I heard that remark. Yes. Poor old Schoenberg. You know, Cathy has a marvelous story about him, that his son became a good tennis player just sort of locally in the area, in the Brentwood area, and one day a man was passing him and said, "Excuse me, are you the father of the tennis player?" And Schoenberg thought he had made it in America. You know, this was marvelous.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.